The sky was clear blue that morning as passengers lined up to board Flight 2187 from Chicago to San Francisco. Captain Thomas Wilson yawned quietly, having woken up at 4 a.m. to prepare for this journey. He'd been flying planes for over 15 years, and most days blended together in a comfortable routine, but something told him today would be different. "Another day, another dollar," joked his co-pilot Rick as they completed their pre-flight checks. Thomas nodded with a smile, watching through the cockpit window as people filed onto the plane. That's when he first noticed them. 6 men in worn leather jackets with bright patches showing a skull with wings. They were louder than the other passengers, laughing and shoving each other as they moved down the jet bridge. Thomas felt a slight knot in his stomach. In all his years flying, he'd developed a sixth sense about trouble. "Looks like we've got some interesting folks today," he mentioned to Rick, who glanced out and raised an eyebrow. Flight attendant Lisa noticed too. She was helping an elderly woman stow her bag when the smell of alcohol hit her nose. The men were already drinking before boarding, never a good sign for a 5-hour flight. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen," she said with her best professional smile. "Can I help you find your seats?" "Don't worry, sweetheart, we'll figure it out," said the tallest one, a man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. His friends chuckled as they pushed past her. Lisa caught Thomas's eye from the cabin and gave him a subtle nod that said, "I'm watching them." They had worked together long enough to communicate without words. As the plane filled up, other passengers started noticing the group too. A young mother held her child closer when they passed by. An older businessman frowned and put on his headphones. 2 college students whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at the men. The bikers had somehow managed to get seats in the same row, even though they were in the middle of the plane. They kept talking loudly, ignoring the safety demonstration, and making jokes about the tiny bottles of alcohol served on planes. "Excuse me," said Lisa, approaching them once everyone was seated. "I need to remind you that if you appear intoxicated, we legally cannot serve you alcohol during the flight." "We're not drunk, just happy," replied the bearded man, who seemed to be their leader. "Don't worry about us." Thomas listened to all this through the cabin updates from his crew. He'd dealt with rowdy passengers before, but something about this group felt different. They weren't just loud, they seemed to be testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Thomas made his standard welcome announcement. "Good morning, everyone. This is Captain Wilson speaking. We're looking at clear skies all the way to San Francisco today, with an expected flight time of 5 hours and 10 minutes. The temperature in San Francisco is currently 65 degrees. Please listen to our flight attendants and don't hesitate to ask if you need anything. We'll be turning off the seatbelt sign once we reach cruising altitude." He paused, then added something he didn't usually say. "And remember, we're all in this metal tube together for the next few hours, so let's make it a pleasant journey for everyone." It was a gentle reminder, but Thomas knew the bikers probably wouldn't take it to heart. As the plane taxied toward the runway, he and Rick went through their final checks, both silently hoping the flight would be uneventful. But as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground, leaving Chicago behind, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. Little did he know that in just a few hours, he would be forced to make one of the most difficult decisions of his career, one that would test everything he'd learned in his years as a pilot and put everyone on board at risk. The plane climbed higher, and the bikers settled in, momentarily quiet as they looked out the windows, but their behavior was like a ticking time bomb. And at 35,000 feet, there would be nowhere to run when it exploded. 3 hours into the flight, Thomas checked his watch and allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The first half of the journey had gone smoothly enough. The seatbelt sign had been turned off, the drink service completed, and most passengers were either napping or watching movies on their screens. But that feeling of calm quickly disappeared when he heard Lisa's voice over the intercom. "Captain, could you check the cabin monitor when you have a moment?" Her tone was professional, but Thomas picked up on the tension underneath. Something was wrong. Thomas glanced at the security feed showing the main cabin. The group of bikers had gathered in the back near the lavatories, forming a small circle that blocked the aisle. They were passing something between them that definitely wasn't airplane peanuts. "They managed to bring their own drinks," Rick said, leaning closer to the screen. How did that get through security? Thomas grabbed the intercom. Lisa, what's the situation back there? The gentlemen in row 23 have some unauthorized beverages. I've already asked them twice to put them away. Thomas could hear the forced patience in her voice. He'd worked with Lisa long enough to know she was using her "I'm about to lose it" tone. Want me to make an announcement? Thomas offered. Let me try once more, Lisa replied. Thomas kept one eye on the monitor as Lisa approached the group again. A heavy-set man with a shaved head noticed her coming and nudged his friends. Their laughter died down as she reached them, but their body language remained defiant. Gentlemen, I need to remind you that consuming personal alcohol is prohibited on this flight, Lisa said, extending her hand. I'll have to collect those bottles. Come on, lady, we're just having a good time, the bearded leader replied. No one's bothered by it. But that wasn't true. Thomas could see several nearby passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly couple had pressed the call button, likely to request a seat change. A businessman 3 rows ahead had removed his headphones and was half-turned in his seat, watching the situation unfold. It's FAA regulations, Lisa insisted. I'm sorry, but I need those bottles now. Or what? Challenged a younger biker with a skull tattoo on his neck. You gonna turn the plane around? Thomas felt his jaw tighten. The disrespect was bad enough, but the growing tension worried him more. At 35,000 feet, there was nowhere to go if things escalated. The cabin feed showed Lisa standing her ground, professional but firm. Sir, I'm not asking again. Either hand over the alcohol, or I'll need to involve the captain, and that could mean charges filed when we land. The bearded leader stepped closer to her. Too close. Look, we paid for these seats just like everyone else. We're not hurting nobody. That's when it happened. As Lisa reached for one of the visible bottles, the man with the skull tattoo grabbed her wrist. It wasn't violent, but it was deliberate, a challenge to her authority. Several passengers gasped. A young woman in the row ahead pulled out her phone and started recording. Take your hand off me right now, Lisa said, her voice steady despite the situation. Thomas was already unbuckling his seatbelt when Rick put a hand on his arm. Protocol says we stay in the cockpit, he reminded Thomas. Let the flight attendants handle it first. But Thomas could see 2 more bikers standing up now, creating a wall between Lisa and the rest of the cabin. She was outnumbered and isolated. Call Pete, Thomas told Rick, referring to the air marshal they'd been quietly informed was on board. Tell him we might need assistance. Over the next few minutes, Thomas watched as Pete, dressed in civilian clothes, casually made his way toward the back of the plane. He was good. Nothing in his movement suggested he was anything but another passenger heading to the lavatory. Meanwhile, the situation was getting louder. The bikers had released Lisa's wrist, but were now deliberately raising their voices, sharing jokes about airplane police and power-tripping attendants. Several passengers had switched seats to move away from the commotion. Thomas made a decision. He flipped on the seatbelt sign and picked up the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. It wasn't true, but it gave Lisa and the other attendants a reason to insist everyone sit down. As he watched the monitor, Thomas knew this was just buying time. The gleam in the bikers' eyes suggested they were just getting started, and they had hours of flight time left to cause trouble. What Thomas didn't know was how quickly things would spiral out of control, and how soon he'd be forced to take extraordinary measures to protect everyone on his aircraft. Things went from bad to worse faster than anyone expected. Despite the seatbelt sign flashing overhead, 3 of the bikers remained standing in the aisle, blocking the path to the lavatories. The tallest one, with the thick beard and tattoo-covered arms, drained the last drops from a small bottle and tossed it onto an empty seat. That was my last one anyway, he said with a smirk at Lisa, who stood at the edge of their group with her arms crossed. Pete, the air marshal, had positioned himself in a seat just 1 row ahead, pretending to read a magazine while keeping the situation in his peripheral vision. Thomas watched everything unfold on the cockpit monitor, his fingers drumming nervously on the control panel. They're pushing to see how far they can go, Rick observed. Thomas nodded. And they think they've got us cornered because we can't exactly pull over. A young mother with a sleeping toddler tried to squeeze past the group to reach the bathroom. "Excuse me," she said quietly, not wanting to wake her child. The bikers barely moved, forcing her to brush against them as she passed. One of them made a comment that didn't carry to the cockpit audio, but Thomas could see the woman's face flush with anger as she hurried past. That's when Andy, another flight attendant, stepped in. "Gentlemen, I need you to return to your seats immediately. The seatbelt sign is on." "Yeah, for turbulence," said the one with the skull tattoo, making air quotes. "Funny how the ride feels perfectly smooth to me." FAA regulations require all passengers to comply with lighted seatbelt signs, Andy insisted, his voice firm but professional. He was newer than Lisa, just 3 years on the job, but handled difficult passengers well. The bearded leader leaned in close to Andy's face. "And what happens if we don't comply?" Before Andy could answer, the plane hit a small pocket of actual turbulence, nothing serious, just enough to cause a slight drop. It was perfect timing. The unexpected motion caught the standing bikers off guard, sending them grabbing for seat backs to steady themselves. "That happens," Andy said with a hint of satisfaction. "Last warning, gentlemen. Seats now, or the captain will have to take further action." For a moment, it seemed like they might listen. 2 of the bikers moved toward their row. But then the one with the skull tattoo grabbed Andy's arm. "You think you're real tough with your little uniform on, don't you?" Thomas reached for the intercom, ready to make another announcement, when Rick suddenly pointed at the monitor. "Look!" 2 more bikers had gotten up and were moving forward in the cabin, not back to their seats, but toward the front of the plane, toward the cockpit. "Lisa," Thomas called over the intercom. "We have 2 passengers approaching the front. What's happening?" Lisa's voice came back strained. "Captain, they're saying they want to talk to you directly." "I've informed them that's not possible during flight." On the monitor, Thomas could see the 2 men pushing past other flight attendants. One was the bearded leader. The other was a stocky man with a shaved head and what looked like a scar running down his cheek. "This is getting out of hand," Thomas muttered. "Get Pete up there. Now." But Pete was trapped behind the group, still blocking the aisle in the back. He was slowly making his way forward, but not fast enough. The bold biker reached the area just outside the cockpit door and began pounding his fist against it. "Hey, Captain, open up. We need to have a chat." Thomas could feel the vibration of the pounding even through the reinforced door. Several passengers in the front rows were visibly frightened now. An elderly woman clutched her husband's arm. A businessman hurriedly stuffed his laptop into his bag, as if preparing for something to happen. "Captain," came Lisa's voice again, more urgent this time. Their threatening tow. Her transmission cut off abruptly. On the monitor, Thomas could see the bearded leader had grabbed the intercom phone from her hand. The scared man continued hammering on the cockpit door. "Listen up, flyboy," the bearded man's voice came through the intercom, loud and slurred. "Either you open this door in the next 60 seconds, or we start making things really uncomfortable out here. Your choice." The 137 passengers watched in stunned silence. Some had phones out, recording the scene despite the flight attendants' previous warnings about electronic devices. A few had pulled out air sickness bags, their faces pale with fear. Thomas exchanged a look with Rick. They both knew the protocol. Under no circumstances was the cockpit door to be opened during a potential security threat. But Thomas also knew that with nearly 3 hours left in the flight, this situation couldn't continue escalating. The pounding on the door grew louder. 50 seconds, Captain, the voice taunted. Clocks ticking. Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The time for standard procedures had passed. What he was about to do wasn't in any flight manual. Thomas stood in the cockpit, his mind racing as the pounding on the door continued. 15 years of flying had taught him to stay calm in emergencies, but this was different. This wasn't a mechanical failure or bad weather, problems he could solve with training and experience. This was human unpredictability at 35,000 feet. 30 seconds, Captain. The bearded biker's voice came through the intercom again. In the background, Thomas could hear Lisa trying to regain control. "Sir, please put that down. You're interfering with aircraft communications." Rick looked up at Thomas with concern. "You're not thinking of opening that door, are you?" Thomas shook his head. "Never. But we can't just sit here and hope they get bored. On the security monitor, Thomas could see that Pete, the air marshal, was still making his way forward but was caught behind a drink cart. The two bikers at the cockpit door were growing more aggressive, and the four in the back were intimidating passengers who tried to speak up. 20 seconds, came the countdown. Thomas grabbed the flight manual from its storage compartment and flipped to the emergency protocol section. There were procedures for medical emergencies, engine failures, even terrorist threats, but nothing specific for drunk bikers threatening the crew short of actual violence. What about diverting? Rick suggested. Denver's not far. We could be on the ground in 30 minutes. Thomas considered it. Landing would get everyone to safety, but it would also mean giving the troublemakers exactly what they wanted, proof that they could control the flight. And once word spread about a plane being diverted because of a few rowdy passengers, copycats would surely follow. 10 seconds, fly boy. The voice was almost gleeful now. Thomas made his decision. He handed control of the aircraft to Rick and reached below his seat, pulling out the emergency response kit. Inside was everything from first aid supplies to restraint devices, tools that pilots hoped never to use but always had on hand. "I'm going to try something," Thomas told Rick. "Keep us steady." He grabbed the plane's announcement system rather than the direct line to Lisa. His voice would be heard throughout the entire aircraft. "This is Captain Wilson speaking." His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority that made several passengers straighten in their seats. "To the gentlemen currently outside the cockpit door and those in the rear of the aircraft, I want to be very clear about something." The pounding paused momentarily as the bikers listened. "Federal law makes it a crime to interfere with flight crew members and attendants in the performance of their duties. This offense carries a possible 20-year federal prison sentence." Thomas paused to let that sink in. On the monitor, he could see the scared biker exchange glances with his bearded friend. "I've already contacted air traffic control about your behavior," Thomas continued, though he hadn't yet. "They've alerted authorities on the ground. But I'm willing to give you one chance to return to your seats, buckle up, and remain quiet for the rest of this flight." The bearded biker grabbed the cabin intercom again. "Nice try, Captain, but we're not stupid. We know you can't do anything up there except hide behind your little door. So how about you stop hiding and face us like a man?" Thomas took a deep breath. The man had just made a crucial mistake. He'd made this personal, a challenge to Thomas's courage. And he'd done it publicly, in front of the entire plane. "Rick, I need you to prepare for emergency protocol Delta 7, Thomas said quietly, reaching for a specific compartment in the cockpit. Rick's eyes widened. "Delta 7? That's not standard procedure. That's from your Air Force days." Thomas nodded grimly. This isn't a standard situation. As an Air Force pilot, before joining commercial aviation, Thomas had received specialized training for dealing with hijacking attempts, training that went beyond what most commercial pilots learned. Delta 7 wasn't in any civilian flight manual. It was a technique developed for military transport pilots to subdue threats without weapons. "It'll be rough," Thomas warned. "Make sure your harness is secure." Thomas turned back to the announcement system. "To all passengers, this is your captain. I need everyone to secure your seatbelts immediately. We're about to experience some unexpected turbulence." He watched the monitor closely. Most passengers quickly complied, sensing the seriousness in his voice. The bikers, however, remained standing, with the two by the cockpit door actually laughing at his announcement. Perfect. Thomas took control of the aircraft again, his hands steady on the controls despite the gravity of what he was about to do. He glanced one last time at the emergency protocols he was about to break, then at the faces of the men threatening his crew and passengers. "Your time's up, gentlemen," he muttered. "Let's see how tough you are when you can't even stand up." Thomas took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the controls. The years of flight training, both military and commercial, had prepared him for this moment. His movements were deliberate as he adjusted his headset and gave Rick a nod. Emergency Protocol Delta 7 commencing in 3, 2, 1. With careful precision, Thomas tilted the plane slightly to the right. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create a gentle sideways force. On the monitor, he could see the immediate effect. The biker with the scar, who had been leaning against the cockpit door, suddenly had to brace himself against the wall. His friend, the bearded leader, stumbled slightly but caught himself on a seat back. "What the hell?" The scared biker's voice carried through the door. Thomas allowed himself the smallest smile and spoke into the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." In the main cabin, the other passengers watched with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. They felt the gentle banking of the plane, nothing alarming. Commercial flights did this all the time. But the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. An older man in business attire caught Lisa's eye and gave her a knowing wink. She responded with the faintest nod while bracing herself against a seat. Thomas let the plane level out for just a moment, long enough for the bikers to regain their balance and confidence, then banked slightly to the left. This time, the movement caught them completely off guard. The bearded leader staggered across the aisle, bumping into an empty drink cart. "Is he doing what I think he's doing?" Rick whispered, a note of admiration in his voice. Thomas didn't answer. He was completely focused now, his eyes darting between the flight instruments and the security monitor. The next movement would be more pronounced. In the cabin, one of the bikers from the back had joined his friends near the cockpit. "What's going on?" he demanded. "The pilot's messing with us," the scared one growled. "Trying to scare us with a little shake." "Not working," the bearded leader shepherded toward the cockpit door. "Nice try, Captain Chicken." Thomas heard the taunt and made his next move. This time, he didn't bank the plane. He eased the nose down just slightly, creating a brief sensation of falling. It was nothing dangerous, just enough to make stomachs flutter. The effect was immediate. The bikers, still standing and now clustered together, all grabbed for support simultaneously, crashing into each other like bowling pins. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the watching passengers. "Still think I'm hiding?" Thomas said over the intercom, his voice calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Pete, the air marshal, had used the distraction to move closer. He now stood only a few rows behind the troublemakers, waiting for the right moment. The bearded leader wasn't laughing anymore. His face had reddened, whether from embarrassment or motion sickness was hard to tell. "You think this is funny? You can't do this. It's against the rules." Thomas let the irony of that statement hang in the air as he executed his next maneuver, a gentle roll that combined with a slight climb. To the seated passengers, safely belted in, it felt like nothing more than moderate turbulence. To the standing bikers, it was like trying to stand on a slowly tilting floor. The youngest biker, who had been quiet until now, suddenly looked green. "Guys, I don't feel so good." Lisa quickly grabbed an air sickness bag and thrust it toward him. Even in this tense situation, her training to help passengers kicked in automatically. The other passengers were starting to understand what was happening. A young woman filmed discreetly on her phone. An off-duty pilot seated in economy class nodded in approval, recognizing the skilled technique that was firm enough to unbalance the troublemakers but gentle enough to maintain the aircraft's safety. "This is your final warning," Thomas announced. "Return to your seats immediately and remain there for the duration of the flight, or the turbulence will get worse." The bearded leader steadied himself against a seat and looked up at the intercom with pure hatred. "You can't keep this up forever. The second you stop, we're coming for you." Thomas responded not with words but with action, a slightly sharper bank that sent the man sprawling into his scared friend. Both men tumbled into the aisle, their tough facade crumbling as they struggled to regain their footing. "Actually," Thomas said quietly to Rick, though his microphone was off, "I can keep this up all the way to San Francisco if I need to." In the cabin, Pete made eye contact with Lisa and mouthed, "Now." She gave him a firm nod. The time had come to end this, one way or another. The Boeing 737 became more than just an aircraft. It transformed into Thomas's ally in this high-stakes confrontation. As he adjusted the controls with practiced precision, the plane responded like an extension of his own body. Each movement was calculated, deliberate, and just strong enough to cause maximum discomfort for the standing troublemakers without risking the safety of the other passengers. "You're still within safe operating parameters," Rick confirmed, monitoring the instruments closely. "But maybe ease up on the next roll." Thomas nodded, his focus unwavering. On the cabin monitor, he could see the bikers struggling to maintain their dignity along with their balance. The bearded leader had managed to pull himself up using a seat back, his face a mixture of anger and growing concern. "This is crazy," shouted the biker with the skull tattoo. "He can't keep doing this." But Thomas could, and he did. He executed another gentle bank, this time combining it with the slightest drop in altitude. The sensation was similar to a car cresting a hill too fast, that flutter in the stomach that makes even the bravest person grip their seat. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The scared biker, who had been trying to maintain his intimidating stance near the cockpit door, suddenly doubled over. His face turned a sickly shade of green as he fought against his body's natural reaction to the motion. "Not feeling so tough now, are you?" muttered an elderly woman in the front row, just loud enough for the bikers to hear. A few nervous chuckles spread through the cabin. The bearded leader shot her a venomous look, but his next step betrayed him. As Thomas angled the plane again, the man's legs went out from under him, and he crashed onto his backside in the middle of the aisle. The fall knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping like a fish out of water. Lisa, bracing herself against a seat, exchanged a quick glance with Pete. The air marshal had positioned himself perfectly, just 4 rows behind the main group of troublemakers. He gave her a subtle nod. He was ready to move when the moment came. Thomas's voice came over the intercom again, calm and measured despite the tension. "I should mention that I spent 8 years flying transport planes in the Air Force before joining commercial aviation. This little exercise is something we called passive pacification. I can keep it up for hours if necessary." The youngest biker was the first to break. "Guys, this isn't worth it. I'm going back to my seat." He staggered down the aisle, clutching seat backs for support, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The scared biker glared at him. Coward. But Thomas wasn't done. He executed his most dramatic maneuver yet, a banking turn that, while still well within the plane's normal operating range, came with enough force to send the unsecured troublemaker scrambling. The scared biker lost his balance completely, tumbling into a row of seats where a young couple quickly pulled their legs aside. The man's head smacked against an armrest, not hard enough to cause injury, but enough to hurt his pride. The bearded leader, meanwhile, had managed to grab onto a drink cart. But when Thomas leveled out the plane, only to immediately bank in the opposite direction, the cart's wheels unlocked and sent it rolling down the aisle with the biker still hanging on. "Make it stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and fear. Passengers who had been terrified minutes ago were now trying to hide their smiles. A middle-aged man in a business suit actually gave a small round of applause. Thomas watched the monitor closely, waiting for the perfect moment. He needed all the bikers off balance at once. As the bearded leader struggled with the runaway cart and the scared biker tried to pick himself up, Thomas saw his chance. "Pete now," he said into his headset. The air marshal moved with surprising speed for a man of his size. In 3 quick strides, he reached the scared biker and identified himself. "Federal Air Marshal. Stay down and put your hands where I can see them." The shock on the biker's face was priceless. He clearly hadn't expected an armed officer to be on board. At the same time, 3 male passengers who had been quietly coordinating stood up simultaneously. One was a retired police officer, another a military veteran, and the third a college wrestling coach. They had been waiting for this moment, silently communicating with nods and hand signals while the bikers were distracted by the plane's movements. Together with Pete, they quickly subdued the disoriented troublemakers. The bearded leader tried to resist, but found himself pinned face down in the aisle by the wrestling coach, who applied a hold that left the man unable to move without causing himself pain. "You can't do this, we have rights." The biker with the skull tattoo protested as plastic restraints were secured around his wrists. "Yes, you do," Pete replied calmly, "and you'll have plenty of time to discuss them with the FBI when we land."